So, my title is New Approaches to Volition and Agency, and I'd like to start by reading you a story. So this is a quotation from a very, very good novel, which I don't think it won a prize, but it should have won a prize. And the author is describing the experience of a young girl who is just becoming an adult, and her mind is wandering. She raised one hand, and she flexed its fingers, and she wondered how this thing, this machine for gripping, this funny little spider on the end of her arm, came to be hers and entirely at her command. Or did her hand have some little life of its own? She bent her finger and she straightened it. The mystery was in the instant before the finger moved, the dividing line between not moving and moving, when her intention took effect like a wave breaking. If only she could find herself at the crest of the wave, she thought she might find the secret part of her that was really in charge. She brought her finger close to her face and she stared at it, urging it to move. But the finger remained still because she was pretending. She wasn't really serious, and because willing the finger to move, or being about to move it, was not the same as actually moving it. And when she did bend the finger finally, the action seemed to start in the finger itself and not in some part of her mind. When did the finger know to move? When did she know to move the finger? There was no way to catch herself out. Great. So you don't really need any scientific lecture on the origins of our voluntary actions and the fascination that we have both at an experiential qualia level, but also at a cultural level, with this idea that humans have the capacity to make voluntary actions. So what I'm going to do is start with a few remarks about what are voluntary actions and how can we investigate them scientifically, and then I'm going to report two sort of aspects of recent research which have tried to do that. So the problem of voluntary action comes from the philosophical debate about whether humans have free will. In science, we don't really talk about free will. It's not a very helpful concept. Perhaps a better way to think scientifically is in terms of a continuum which distinguishes two classes of action on the basis of the cause of their actions. So in neuroscience, we know a lot about so-called reflex actions, which we can think of as being externally triggered responses to an immediate stimulus. So this beautiful thing here will produce very coordinated, very elegant actions if you touch it or if you put a little drop of a chemical on its skin. And those actions are extremely stereotyped, normally very quick, very functional. They'll move away from an aversive stimulus. But the critical point is that there are some actions which are not quite like that. There are some actions which seem to be more than reflex. They seem to be somehow internally generated. They have what Mike Shadlen has called freedom from immediacy. Some of our actions do not seem to be immediate responses to any obvious stimulus. You know, why did I lift my hand? Why did she say that? Why did he do that? It's hard to explain exactly what stimulus might have caused a lot of these actions. So in neurophysiology, rather than thinking about actions as being free, we tend to think of them as being either more internally generated or more externally triggered. So there's some interesting conceptual features about this definition. So everybody agrees about this kind of action, and internally generated actions are really defined by exclusion. They're actions which are not reflexes. And maybe humans are particularly good at showing these. You get these wonderful, intelligent, rational creatures like this who can produce internally generated actions, whereas the worm can only produce externally triggered actions. So this is the sort of classical way that we've inherited from neurophysiology of being able to talk about volition. I think this is perhaps the most useful phrase, freedom from immediacy. Now, a few years ago, somebody, Paul in fact, challenged me, and he said, "What do you mean by volition? Come on, put your money where your mouth is and give us some actual definitions." And I was shocked and thought, actually, this is really hard. So I tried to do this, and it seemed to me that there's no single marker of a voluntary action, but it means a number of things. So volition being the process associated uniquely with voluntary actions rather than involuntary movements or reflex type actions. So volition clearly has to lead to movement. It has to be reasons responsive. So in philosophy, people insist that a voluntary action is an action that you make for a reason. So why did the chicken cross the road? Right? So the chicken had a reason to cross the road, and if it's a good reason, we might say the chicken made a voluntary action. So these actions are outcome directed. They don't have an obvious trigger stimulus, which is like saying they're non-reflexive. Voluntary actions often have an interesting element of spontaneity or unpredictability or even creativity. So, a lot of these big cultural ideas are associated with voluntary action. And there's an interesting argument about whether voluntary actions are necessarily conscious. Are they always accompanied by a feeling of, I did that, which I'll talk about during my talk. So this is, not every voluntary action has every one of these features on the list, and no single feature is necessary. But some subset of these features will tend to make us say that action is voluntary rather than involuntary. Now, this table is kind of interesting. It provided some response to Paul's challenge to define volition. But the interesting feature about this table is it's quite neural, because all of these features of actions which make us think that they're voluntary can all be turned or can all be associated with a specific constraint or comment about how the brain works. So if voluntary action if volition leads to movement, then the brain circuits that do volition should be connected to the motor cortex. If volition is reasons responsive and outcome directed, you would expect connections from reward areas and to areas for planning and monitoring. You'd expect weak connections to purely sensory areas. You'd expect independence from habitual circuits, because spontaneity and habit seem to be somehow opposite modes of behavior regulation. So I think although volition is elusive as a concept, we can see in terms of brain science what kinds of brain circuits we might be looking for. What I want to do in the sort of 45, 50 minutes of my talk that remain is just talk about two topics, two quite firm and interesting topics which have emerged in the last 10 years or so in the neuroscience of voluntary action. So the first one is the question of origins and generation. Where do our voluntary actions come from? And that's sort of going back to the free will idea. And the second one is to do with agency, which is the feeling that your voluntary actions can have outcomes on the outside world. So I did that. I made her cry. I made him happy. I built the house. I changed the world. That was me, right? So that's, the really important thing about voluntary actions is what we can do with them. It's the sense of agency. Okay, so what brain events precede volitional action? Well, all work on the origin of voluntary action always starts with a Libet experiment. I guess most of you are quite familiar with the Libet experiment, so I'll go quite quickly. The Libet experiment is a controversial but interesting experiment which purports to look at the relationship between the neural origins of action and the conscious experience of deciding to do something. It's an experiment with two parts. The first part is a clock, and it's a very funny clock because it's very small. It's got one hand, and the hand goes round every 2,560 milliseconds. So the clock it's really just a chronometer. It's a ruler which allows you to report when you have some particular subjective experiences. So Libet was working in the tradition, which goes back to the 19th century, of mental chronometry, trying to study when people experience things. And actually, that's a really important question. Most of what we know in psychology about consciousness comes from asking the question, when, right? The second part of the Libet experiment is the movement part. The person is asked to make a voluntary action. In this example, it's pressing the button. And the critical point is you make the voluntary action when you feel like it. So in Libet's original paper, the instruction was, or the writing says, press the button whenever you feel the urge to do so. So in the psychological and neurological work on volition, the word urge keeps appearing all the time. And it's really odd because it's a Freudian word. And it has lots of strange cultural overtones. So I'm not sure that people ever really have an urge to press the button. And there's a big problem with these kinds of experiments because how do participants understand what they're supposed to do? Press the button whenever you feel like it. This is the expression that we use in our experiments. But quite often, the participant will look at you and you say, do you mean now? And you say, no, not now, when you feel like it. And they'll say, but I don't feel like it. And then, of course, the experiment becomes very long because they are paid by the hour to participate in the experiment. So they have an infinite ability to use the balance in my grant by making the experiment very long, by waiting a long time before they want to press the button. That will become important later. So, in fact, what happens is people want to get the experiment finished. So the critical point is that you don't press the button when the trial starts or when the clock starts to move. You press the button at a time that you choose. We don't know why you choose it. We don't know how you choose it, but you chose it. Nobody told you now. You decided when to press the button. So the timing, at least, of this action is internally generated. Okay, so let's suppose that the person feels the urge to move for some reason. They press the button, that should be here, there we go. The clock continues to rotate, it stops in a random location, and then the participant is asked to indicate the time on the clock at which they first felt the urge to move. So they're asked to give a report of the moment at which they experienced will, decision, urge, intention, something which preceded the movement and which was associated with the fact that they then pressed the button. There's been lots of arguments about exactly what words you should use in order to get people to make these reports. A lot of people think that the whole thing is a fabrication. We'll come back to that later. But in this particular case, we know that the person actually pressed the button when the clock hand was at 25. They tell us, well, I think I first felt the urge to move when the clock hand was at 23. We know exactly how fast the clock is going, so we can work out the time of their conscious will. Right? That's the notion of the Libet experiment. And while this is going on, Libet is recording EEG, and he was able to record over the frontal motor cortex a signal called the readiness potential, which I'll tell you more about later. But the readiness potential is a large and quite reliable ramp-like negative going potential. So in EEG, we always plot negative at the top and positive at the bottom, and the reason for this is odd. When a brain area is active, you tend to record a negative potential above it. So I don't know if that's profound or just how things are, but it means that in the EEG tradition, we tend to plot negative up. So this is an example of a readiness potential. It's a schematic, but you can see this gradual ramp-like negativity, which goes up and up and up to reach a peak just around the time that the person presses the button, around the time of movement onset. So this had been known since the 1960s, and it's a characteristic feature of voluntary movement. So the harder you think about pressing the button, the bigger and earlier the readiness potential is. So it seems to be some sort of marker of volition or effort or trying. And the result of the Libet experiment is quite simple. The average time at which people report what Libet called W judgment for judgment of will, this moment of feeling an urge to move, or what I would call conscious intention, is here, 206 milliseconds before you press the button. But the interesting point is that your brain had actually apparently begin to get ready to press the button long before that. So the readiness potential often begins more than a second before you move, but you only seem to have the conscious feeling that you're going to move a couple of hundred milliseconds before you do. So the sort of worry about the Libet experiment is there's a period of time represented by this grey arrow here, which is often a second or more in duration, which for the brain is extremely long, during which it looks as though your brain is preparing a voluntary action, but you don't yet know it. So how voluntary is that? In what sense is this action yours or up to you or really internally generated? Could you be held responsible for this voluntary action since it was your brain that did it and you only knew about it just at the last moment? Maybe you wouldn't have had time to stop. So there are a lot of legal implications of this kind of experiment for the way that we use responsibility in our legal systems, for example. So that will be familiar to some of you, but perhaps not to all of you. And this experiment has really driven the way that we think about voluntary action ever since it was done in the 1980s. I think Libet actually did it in the 1970s, but I've heard anecdotally from secondhand from somebody who spoke to him that he knew that if he published this experiment, he would never get tenure. So he deliberately did not publish the experiment for several years until he got tenure, and then he published it in 1983. Okay, so a lot of people have criticized these experiments, and there are a lot of problems with them. The first one is that normally in a good experimental method, you control the inputs and you measure the outputs. This is the engineering principle of system identification. In voluntary action, how do you control the inputs? If you say to people, press the button when you feel like it, you're abandoning control of the experiment to the participant. So you're giving up on the system identification approach, the engineering approach to human cognition. So it's really unclear how people interpret this instruction, make a voluntary action when you feel like it. A lot of people think that what participants are trying to do is to just make random actions in order to keep the experimenter happy. And there's a general skepticism that, what we really mean by volition, what we really mean by free will isn't pressing buttons in laboratories. So there's a general sort of critique. Okay, well, I'm going to leave that there. I think some of these criticisms are justified, but I think the Libet experiment has been useful, and I think it does capture some of the features that we need to explain involuntary action, principally because nobody tells you when to press the button. You do decide for yourself. Now, the whole field has been blown open. The whole field of neurophysiology of voluntary action has been blown open in the last 5 years by a recent paper by Aaron Scherger, who suggests that the readiness potential, this marker of the brain getting readier and readier and readier and readier for a voluntary action, which has been the sort of the classic dependent variable that we've used in these studies, he thinks that we've misunderstood it. And his idea is that the readiness potential, this apparent build-up to voluntary action, is actually just noise. It's not a signal at all. It looks like a signal, but it's not. And his argument is that the timing of our voluntary actions is actually random. There's no process, there's no cause, there's no cause in the deterministic sense. And from a cognitive point of view, there's a very strong element of stochasticity and spontaneity in how we make voluntary actions. And you'll remember that was one of the features of voluntary action that was in my table originally, this idea of innovation and spontaneity. So what Scherger imagines, it's a computational model, so it's a competence model, not a performance model. He's showing that these stochastic models could account for the data. That doesn't prove that they do, but it shows that they could. So he imagines a neural signal which is effectively a random walk. So in something like a Libet experiment, you know that you're going to have to move at some point, and your movement will occur when a neural signal reaches some threshold level. So this represents a threshold at which you're going to press the button. But the moment that you actually press the button depends on the random walk of some unspecified neural signal, and you can see that it might hit the threshold here, it might go down again, and then hit the threshold much later. So each of these traces represent just one example of a random walk of this stochastic function, and the moment that each example hits the threshold and you press the button produces an arrow here. So these would be different trials, different button presses in a Libet experiment. And what you can see is that if you just look at the data immediately before you press the button, if you lock your data to the threshold crossing, to the moment of pressing the button, you always inevitably approach the threshold from below, right? That's the only way that you can press the button in this model. So if you look at back in time at what's happening before the action, and you average all the different random walks which took you to the threshold, what you get is something which looks remarkably like a readiness potential. So here is the average of all the random walks which take you to the threshold for pressing the button. And you'll notice that this graph is completely illegible, and that's because Haggard plotted negative down instead of negative up. So I've used my computer graphics skills to invert all of the axes. So in black, what it says is the model. So this is the average of a lot of random stochastic walks. And in gray, it says empirical. So this is his recording of some readiness potentials from some participants doing a Libet-like task. And you can see that if you just average a bunch of noise, you do get something which looks remarkably like a readiness potential. So the intuition here is that we've been thinking completely wrong about the causation of voluntary actions. And in our classical models, people thought that, I don't know, there's some sort of internal intention and decision, which is followed by a period of preparation, which then leads to action. And people thought that we can record the readiness potential as a marker of the brain activity associated with this preparation, right? And what Haggard is saying is, no, that's not how it works. There is effectively just random neural activity, which may be subject to context. It may be that different situations or different drugs or whatever will change the way that this random neural activity works. But this random neural activity is just fluctuating, and it's the fluctuations which will eventually, at some random moment, trigger you into action. And if you average lots and lots of these fluctuations, it will look like a signal, look like a readiness potential, but it's really just fluctuations, it's really noise. And this is a very interesting paper because it radically changes the way that we thought both about the neurophysiology but also about where our actions come from. So you've got two different models of what you're doing. Either you're deciding to do it and then doing it in a very systematic and deterministic way, or your actions are kind of just happening to you at random. And interestingly, Haggard leaves open the possibility that maybe there is a moment for decision, but it's after the random fluctuations have tipped you up to the threshold. So the random stochastic fluctuation brings you to the threshold of action, and then maybe you can say, oh, hold on, Patrick, you're about to press the button. Are you sure you want to do that? So there's always a tendency in these kinds of models for people to leave some kind of possibility for saying no. Okay, so this has been an interesting development, a rather nice example, I think, of the interplay between mathematical modeling and neural signals. I want to tell you now about a little bit of work that we've been doing around this area, which uses an interesting argument, which I originally met right back during my PhD time when I was doing motor control. So in motor control, the logic that we have for understanding how the brain generates movement patterns is very poor. There are very few arguments or very few ways of thinking in motor control, and almost the only one that we did have, at least then, was the so-called argument from invariance. And the argument from invariance says that if a parameter, if some feature of behavior is relatively stable and invariant, then we assume that this parameter is associated with some cognitive process that is actively controlled. So in the motor control literature, people, for example, noticed that when you make a movement of your arm or your leg or your head or anything, any kind of movement, it tends to have a very characteristic velocity profile where the velocity smoothly increases and then comes down again. And you always get the same velocity profile. So if you always get it, the brain must be controlling it. There must be a reason for it. That's really what the argument for invariance says. But the interesting point about the argument from invariance is it's using stability versus variability of a signal in order to infer where it comes from, to infer its control, to infer how it's controlled. Everybody happy with that? So just to illustrate that, let's consider some cognitive processes. Let's consider some cognitive process A and another cognitive process C, and let's consider what happens in between. So in the upper graph here, we've got a specific cognitive process B, which has to happen after A and before C. So we've got a serial linear chain. And if this is the case, then if you looked at the variability of some relevant signal, like an fMRI recording or an EEG recording or something, during this period when process B is active, you'd expect to see low variability. But if, on the other hand, you have a process A, and then almost anything could be happening in between A and C. So there's no active control whatsoever, and there's no specific cognitive process which has to come between A and C. Then in between A and C, I might be thinking about the washing, I might be planning my next talk, I might be breathing, all kinds of stuff could be happening. And then you'd expect that the variability of your neural signals of your data will be very, very high. So this is kind of trivial, but it's quite rare that you see it written down. So I wanted to present it in a tutorial fashion. The argument from invariance says that if you see something more like this and less like this, then you can say, oh, B exists. Something's happening during B, during this time, and we can call it B, and we can say that there is a genuine cognitive process which is relevant to the control of this ABC chain, which is happening during this period. Okay, so that's the argument that we're using, and that's one of the innovations that we're making in studying voluntary control, is rather than looking at the average readiness potential, rather than looking at the mean neural activity prior to voluntary actions, we're going to look at the variability. Okay, so that's coming in a moment. The other thing that we've done in our work is we've tried to get away from this horrible instruction, press the button when you feel like it. That's one of the weakest features, I think, of most of our research on voluntary action, because it doesn't really capture what we mean by volition, and it doesn't give people any particular clear reason to press the button. So we wanted to develop a way of studying voluntary action which made human voluntary actions, human voluntary button pressers, internally generated, but also reasons responsive in a clear way. And the way that we did that was to borrow a task developed by Mike Shadlin for perceptual decision making. So he was working on monkeys, we were working on humans. This is a very, very well-known task. The participant views a screen on which there are lots of dots moving. And after a while, the dots begin to move coherently to the left, in which case they make one response, or coherently to the right, in which case they make another response. So this is exactly what we've done. The only thing that's interesting about our version of the task is you're looking at a fixation cross. The dots begin to move to the left or the right, but only after a very long and very variable delay. So you might have to wait 200 seconds watching the screen before the, bloody dots actually start to move. It's really boring, really boring. So there's a very long and very unpredictable wait, and it can sometimes be exceptionally tedious. When the dots do move, then it's really easy because they move with 100% coherence, and you press the left button or the right button, and if you get it right, which you will because it's really easy when they're 100% coherent, you get a big reward like 10p or something like that. The problem is the wait, because the wait's boring. And you are in an experiment which is 1 hour long, and you know it's 1 hour long. So all the time that you're just waiting for the dots, you're getting bored and you're not making money. So people have the possibility of making what is called a skip response. Instead of waiting until the dots move, you can press both the left and the right keys simultaneously to skip immediately to the next trial and earning only a small reward for the skip response. So the critical thing about the skip response is it's internally generated. Nobody tells you to skip. You decide to skip. But it's also reasons responsive. Why do you skip? You skip because you prefer to get a small reward and spend less time. So it's a little bit like temporal discounting. Okay? But the critical point is that there's no stimulus telling you to skip. It's a voluntary, internally generated action. So this is our operationalization of a voluntary action. Interestingly, we never had to tell people we're studying voluntary action, you have free will. We told people you're doing a perceptual decision-making task. So people didn't think that this was about volition at all. Now, you always need a control condition, and the control condition is quite tricky. The one that we've done is to have a separate block of trials, completely separate block of trials, where you cannot decide for yourself when to skip. But you are sometimes told you must skip now by a change in the color of the fixation cross, which occurs at a time yoked to when you chose to make a voluntary skip in the previous block. Okay? So in this control block, you can't do anything for yourself. You can only do what you're told, but what you are told to do is exactly the same as what you had previously chosen to do in the voluntary block. All right? Okay, so that's the operationalization. And now let's look at the data. So we're using EEG to measure the activity over the frontal motor cortex. So this is an electrode about here. And here is time in milliseconds and amplitude in microvolts with, of course, negative up and positive down. Now, what you can see if you look at the red data, which is the mean of self-initiated or voluntary skip responses, you see a gradual negative going signal building up and up to the time of the voluntary skip response and then reversing, just like the standard readiness potential. And if you look at what happens prior to the externally triggered skips, you see a completely flat line. This is probably the time that the fixation cross begins to turn red on average, and only then do you see any neural activity. Now, for those of you who are sort of very observant, you'll notice that these tracers never actually become negative, so they're negative going, they're moving into negativity, but they never actually become negative. And the reason for that is that we chose to baseline correct our EEG epochs at the time that you press the button. All right, so we said EEG fluctuates all the time, right? People's voltage drifts up and down during the course of the experiment, so you always have to bring it down to a baseline. And normally in an EEG experiment, you present a stimulus like a flash, and you take the baseline just before the stimulus. But in a voluntary action experiment, there's no stimulus. So how do you know when to take the baseline? And the normal decision in this literature has been to say, we'll take the baseline before the readiness potential begins, sometime long before the movement. But how long? How do you know when the readiness potential begins? How do you know when the processes that lead to a voluntary action start? You don't. You've got no idea. That would be circular, begging the question to take any kind of baseline before the voluntary action. So the only thing that we felt confident in doing technically was in baselining the EEG data to the one event that we can actually be sure about, which is the fact that the person presses the button. That's the only thing we know in these paradigms. So we baseline corrected it so that the voltage is zero at time zero, at the time that you press the button, and that's why this signal never gets actually negative, but you can see that it's negative going prior to the action. So that's why I think it's a classic readiness potential. So fine, you can get readiness potentials in this paradigm for these voluntary skip responses, and you don't get them when you're just unable to voluntarily skip and waiting until you're told to skip. If you look at the individual trial RPs, so these are the individual trials, there are hundreds of them, of which these are the averages. What you can see is it's a mess, so the signal to noise ratio of EEG is extremely poor, but I think you can see that the red lines are more clustered than the blue. And that would mean that the variability of what the brain is doing before a voluntary action is lower than the variability of what the brain is doing when it's not preparing a voluntary action. Okay? And that's this argument from invariance. So what we're doing here is we're measuring the variability, or rather the standard deviation, of lots and lots of individual segments of EEG prior to a button press. So here's standard deviation in microvolts as a function of time. 0 is the time of the skip. Now, when you align all of your individual trials on the moment of action and you baseline correct them so that they've got a mean of 0 at time 0, of course you'll get 0 variability at the time of alignment. That's just mathematics. It's not interesting. And of course, as you go away from the time of alignment to the time of the baseline, of course you'll see that the variability tends to increase, right? So if you sample data linked to any particular lock point in a process, you'll always find that the variability increases on either side, right? A nice example of this is, suppose you look at 100 couples who all get married on the same day, right? And you ask them, how happy are you? They're all going to say, oh, I'm really, really happy. But if you ask them the same question 10 days later, the variability will be a bit higher. So some will be happy and some will be less happy. And if you ask them 10 years later, the variability will be enormous. And also before, if you ask them 10 days before they got married, how happy are you? Some will be very happy and some less happy. And if you ask them 10 years before, then again, massive variability. So you always get variability either side of a lock point. So the fact that this curve has a V shape is just a technical artifact. It's not important. What is important is the difference between the way that the standard deviation drops prior to a voluntary skip in red and prior to an externally triggered skip in blue. So don't worry about the shape of the lines, worry about the difference between the shapes. And what you can see here is that there's a period beginning about a second and a half before you make a voluntary action, where the brain seems to be converging on a relatively invariant, relatively stable pattern of EEG compared to the control block of trials where you're not making voluntary actions and just waiting to be told what to do. All right? So by the argument from invariance, there's some additional process going on prior to a voluntary action, which stabilizes what the brain's doing onto a relatively invariant pattern of activity, which means that there should be some specific cognitive process leading up to the voluntary action. Tony?
I don't understand why you need the argument from invariance. You've already got the graph at the top there, the clear difference between the two.
Well, Aaron Sugar has been quite clear that the graph at the top shouldn't be interpreted as a signal. It could be the average of noise. And if you just have noise, then you would expect high variability rather than low variability. So it seems to me that the question about whether you have a fixed process or simply a stochastic process can usefully be answered by studying variability rather than mean.
You've addressed this issue by controlling your experiment.
Yeah, that's, to some extent. I think...
No, so there's a big difference in the shape of the curve for the two events. I think that I sort of buy the argument from invariance, but I would worry a little bit about the fact that because this curve is a different shape, you might get less variance in it. There might be the starting point for it is lower, and that might be the reason why you get less variance. Maybe that's room for it to move up and down.
Ceiling effects. Okay, yeah. No, I hear that. I think it'll become a little bit more interesting later when you see how the variability changes. But okay. So the point is that to the extent that you get this additional drop in variability, you might say, oh, during this period prior to the voluntary action, there really is some specific cognitive process going on. It's not that the brain is just doing any random thing. There is if you like, a cognitive ontological unit. There's a process which we can call preparation, or we can call it convergence on a fixed precursor of voluntary action. Now, just to show that this convergence on a fixed precursor is specific to voluntary action, remember that in this experiment, you've got the skip responses, which are voluntary, but you've also got some trials where the person waits and they do actually wait long enough to see the dots moving, and they then make a stimulus-driven response to the dots. So we can do exactly the same to look at the brain activity prior to the stimulus-triggered dot responses. Okay, so you don't see a readiness potential prior to this dot, which makes sense because it's a response to a stimulus rather than internally generated action. But more importantly, you don't see any difference at all between what the brain is doing in the variability prior to the dot responses in the block where people are able to make self-initiated skips and in the block where they're only allowed to make externally triggered skips. So it's not the case that in the two blocks the brain is in a completely different state. It's quite possible that just when the dots appeared, you were actually preparing to make the skip response. That seems quite likely. You're in the voluntary action condition. So the actual sort of underlying state of the brain and EEG seems to be exactly the same in both blocks. But in the case where you actually make a voluntary skip, there seems to be this additional drop in variability. All right?
Can you indicate, Patrick, here, where then this, in the forced skip condition, where does the cue appear to skip?
Where it appears in central fixation, and it appears, this is action locked, so I can only say on average where it appears. It appears about here, about 500, 600 milliseconds before you skip. and it appears gradually. So the fixation cross gradually changes color to red. So I can't say exactly because it's actually not.
Over how much time?
Boo, I'm working from memory here. I can't remember the time constant of the color change.
Tell me any number, you know that.
It's around a second. It changes gradually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Patrick, can I ask, because maybe I don't understand it well enough, but how would you ever expect this to be noise driven if from the beginning there's a cognitive element? People get, they know if it takes too long, I'm going to press the bloody button. So they get more and more annoyed at it. It's like standing in front of a red light, you know.
Yeah.
You think, well, shall I stay here? It takes too long, at some point you go.
Yeah.
You're continually building up to that.
Yeah.
Cognitive.
Right. The concept, the stochastic model suggests that the actual moment when you give up waiting and start to walk across the road or press the skip response is determined by a random process. So what the stochastic model denies is that there's a specific cognitive process which says, I'm going to wait for 3 seconds and then press 1, 2, 3, bang. So the stochastic model insists on the idea that the time at which we make voluntary actions is driven by a process with a large element of randomness. I'm not saying I believe that, I'm saying that's the model that we're looking at. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit in a bit more detail about the model. There's the actual architecture of the model as in the Scherger paper taken from McClellan. So you have a drift and a leak. So this is a leaky integrator, and then here is a noise. And we've made one change to this model, which we've allowed the noise to change over time. So delta C is a time-varying noise scaling factor. And what we've done is we've taken that equation, taken that model, and we fitted it to each participant's mean readiness potentials. And if we do that, we can find what would be the value of the drift and the leak and the noise, the changing noise in the self-initiated skip condition and in the externally triggered skip condition. And then what we've done is we've said, let's simulate the standard deviations for individual trials based on these parameter fits. And let's see what the standard deviation of the individual trial data would do, and particularly whether it captures this feature of our actual recordings, that we get greater convergence and lower variability for voluntary skips than for externally triggered skips. And what you can see is that the drift rate and the leak are slightly different between voluntary, self-initiated actions and externally triggered actions, but neither of those differences can actually reproduce the change in variability that we measure. If we allow this time-varying noise scaling factor, that is also different between the self-initiated condition and the externally triggered condition. So our mean RPs are best fitted by a progressively reducing noise in the voluntary skip condition and a progressively increasing noise in the externally triggered condition. And if you simulate the individual trials using these parameters and calculate their standard deviation, you reproduce exactly the pattern in the data, namely that you get an additional drop in variability prior to voluntary actions. So what this means, I think, is that a stochastic model could actually account for this convergence of brain activity on a single reliable pattern prior to voluntary action. It could account for it, but only if you allow the idea that there is neural noise, but it changes over time, and prior to a voluntary action, it goes down. Prior to a voluntary action, it goes down. Yep.
Let's go back to the model. Like, you're not forced to call C noise, right? C
It's
is
a
a time-varying function that changes the slope of your curve of the response.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We're not forced to call this noise.
No,
anything.
You're forced to say it's stochastic, and there are some features of its stochasticity.
Well, but it's time varying. It's time varying, and in a systematic way, it changes the slope, depending on whether you're in a voluntary or in the forced condition, right?
Yeah.
So that means it could also be a controlled process.
I think you're trying to say what I'm trying to say. So what I'm trying to say...
I'm psychic, you didn't know.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is, so I've showed you this classical model with a fixed process of preparation. I've shown you the Scherger model, which says there's only fluctuation. In our data, what we found is that you get a drop in variability, which you could model as being fluctuation, but only if you say It's a period of fluctuation during which the noise is changing in a systematic way and going down. So you could say that there is a random process prior to voluntary action, but it involves some specific controlled change in the neural noise. So actually this model and this model seem to me very, very similar, right? So you can emphasize either the systematic, consistent things that happen in the brain prior to voluntary action, or you can emphasize the randomness, but it doesn't seem to be pure randomness without this additional systematic control of noise. Just to finish this section, quite a lot of other bits of work happening in executive function and in the cognitive control, for example, in Parkinson's disease, which specifically deal with this question of can you change your own neural noise? So there are other literatures which are consistent with this. I'm going to show you one other experiment, and then I'll take a few questions on this section. So this is a second experiment which had 2 sessions. The first session is exactly a repetition of a replication of what I showed you before. You can see a readiness potential in red for the voluntary skips, but not for the instructed skips in blue, and you can see a greater drop in standard deviation for the voluntary prior to voluntary skips compared to instructed skips. The people then came back the next day, or the next week, I can't remember, and they were told it's exactly the same, but you're only allowed half the number of skips today that you chose to make yesterday. So we're rationing free will, right? So you're still free, but only half as free as you were. Now, this seemed to me quite interesting because it's basically, possibly it's changing the value, but it's certainly changing the sort of habituality or deliberateness of the voluntary skip. Because if you limit people's voluntary skips, then presumably they're thinking harder about how they use them. Right? They're less habitual. They're less sort of saying, oh, I'm bored waiting, I'm going to skip. They're actually thinking, do I want to skip or do I not? And what you see is that as you make the skips limited and presumably therefore less habitual and more deliberately chosen, the drop in variability prior to them becomes even more marked than when you can just skip as much as you like. Now, I don't really see how a random process could explain that. It seems to me that you have to say there's something like thought, effort, deliberation, which has a neural marker of which this is a candidate. So, yeah.
Can we look at the specifics here? So that you would expect that in session 2, the slope of the, let me see, red curve will be steeper than 1, right? This is what we want.
We can only really make an inference about the difference between the area under the curve, the difference in the area under the curve between the red and the blue. So you're always going to get a V shape and a slope in your standard deviation. You're always going to get that, and that's because of this alignment and baseline correction. That's technical. The only thing I think that you can interpret is whether the variability drops more aggressively in one condition compared to another. And I think that comparison needs to be made within a session. I don't think you can compare my EEG today with my EEG next week as
offset difference, for instance, right?
Right. So people are generally more variable in session 1 than they are in session 2, and there could be lots of reasons for that, like I don't know, fatigue, familiarity. But I think what I want to insist on is the difference between the red and the blue lines within session, and this is a cluster corrected type statistical approach. So just to summarize that, we've got a new definition of the volition and RP, which is internally generated and reasons responsive. And I think that we can say that there's a specific neural precursor of voluntary action, which we can see is perhaps responsible for this consistent convergence of brain activity. So before you make a voluntary action, your brain is doing something. It's not doing just anything. There may be a random process to it, but the noise in that random process is under active control. Now, there were 2 or 3 questions. I've then got some more stuff on agency, but let's take the questions from this bit first. Yeah. So there was, I think it was 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1.
Yeah. So I'm Jonathan Johnson. So I just was wondering. So in the drift diffusion process, in the situation where they were instructed to skip. So in the version where they were instructed to skip, did you see a progressive rise in noise, as opposed to a decrease in noise with time?
Right, okay. So I think I can't answer that question because all of our measures of variability are inevitably sitting on this this massive V shape, which is, let's go back to the right one, this massive V shape pattern, which is just the technical consequence of aligning on a marker point. So we can't say whether there's, I mean, there might be an increase in the blue line, which is masked by the general decrease caused by time alignment. So unless I can think of a clever way to remove this time alignment problem, I can't answer your question directly. Why would you expect an increase, though?
No, that was just what I thought I saw on the other slide, which shows where you compare the I think going forward, that one there, the change in noise.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There.
Right, so this is the C, this is the delta C parameter. And yeah, that's true, that's positive. I think this confidence interval will include 0, although the difference is significant. Yeah, it's a good point. I'll have to think about how to get at that.
Right, okay, thank you.
Now, I can't remember who was 2. Hi.
So, a question about the next slide, because when you're comparing, no, another one. When you're comparing this, so the red curves look really similar, so the change is occurring on the difference that, so that the difference between the conditions now is mostly due to that
to the blue, yeah. I think that's similar to Paul's question. It's a good point. So what we've done, what we've done here statistically is to compare the red and the blue in each session, because we can feel confident about that. And I think, I mean, it's a little bit like with fMRI. You always prefer to make contrast within sessions rather than across sessions. But I'd have to look at that point, yeah. So, yeah, it's a good point.
So I was wondering, like, how are the voluntary skips distributed in time? Because what I think is that if that was like a completely random process, you would also expect like a sort of uniform distribution in time of the random skips.
Yeah. They're not uniform. So that in fact, if you calculate these sort of equations, you can work out the optimal time to skip, because you know the experiment is an hour long. And you know how much the reward is if you wait for the dots versus if you skip. And you know how you presumably want to make as much money as possible. So the optimal time to skip is in fact about 2 seconds. Okay. In fact, people tend to wait about 7 plus or minus 7. Right? Okay. So, and that's probably because people think that it's an experiment about dots and they want to see some dots, right, just to remind them.
But isn't this like a sort of like stronger argument, like against a pure stochastic model?
I think so. I mean, you know, the clever modelers always have wiggle room, right? And the Scherger model, if you look at it, it's got lots of wiggle room, like all good models have. But there's an interesting feature in it, which it says that there are some contextual effects, something about the context that you're in, which will move your neural signal closer to the threshold. So in his paper, he says, well, maybe when you're in a Libet experiment, then maybe you allow yourself you allow your neural noise to move quite close to the threshold. Now, I suspect that what a stochastic model person would say is, well, you know, there are features about the context which may change from trial to trial or whatever. So, but that's just wiggle room. Yeah. Yes. Hi.
So I like the experiment where you use the same, you know, subjects and then put a contingent on them. But you know, the assumption is that it's the same brain that you're testing. Have you thought about whether you can stratify your data based on risk takers versus not risk takers?
Great question. Yeah, so at the moment this work is just at the level of small experimental laboratory samples. Presumably there's some interesting underlying neurocognitive variable which will be associated with risk-reward type structures. And you can imagine beautiful, large n equals 100 individual difference experiments. You can see what the predictions would be, but we haven't done that yet. I tend to always focus on getting small group studies done first before I think about individual differences.
It's nice. The other is more technical. As an engineer, you know, usually we don't deal so much with standard deviation when we're comparing two signals. We look at variance, which is the square of that. Yeah. Have you looked at variance as, you know, to get at that noise parameter, the delta C? Variance is the
Yeah,
square.
yeah. No, that's true. Yes, and of course in engineering you like the fact that variances are additive for independent sources, and they sort of behave more nicely in that respect. No, we've always looked at the standard deviation. We've never looked at variance, but
What it would do is that last curve that you had, it would make it invariant with respect to whether it's positive or negative.
yeah.
Yeah, that mountain,
Yeah.
two above.
Yeah, okay, that's a useful point. Thank you. I'll think about that. Tony?
Yeah, and it's a lovely experiment, but I think a lot is riding on this argument about invariance that you set it up with, because, I mean, I could just say, well, what's happening here is that you are, in the skip condition, you're giving somebody something to think about, and it's something very specific. Should I skip or not?
Mm-hmm.
And in the other condition, they're just getting told to skip, so their mind is wandering, like you say. They're
Great
thinking about
point.
the
And
washing.
I briefly flashed up the reason why you're wrong.
Okay.
So if you just look at the right-hand column here, the right-hand column is what happens when the dots appear, they move to the left or to the right, and you respond. Now, if you're in the block where you could be skipping, you could make a voluntary skip, presumably you were thinking, oh, I wonder if I should voluntarily skip, and then the dots started to move. So presumably you were expecting to skip and you were thinking about skipping, but on that particular trial, you didn't actually skip before the dots appeared, and then you responded to the dots. Okay? So if there's really something about thinking about skipping or expecting to skip or having to remember that you could voluntarily skip, if there's really something different about what the brain is doing just because of the possibility of making a voluntary action, then you ought to see the additional drop in variability. So for example, if expecting to skip changed the autocorrelation profile of the EEG and changed the frequency spectrum in some profound way, then why don't you see here what you see here specific to the voluntary action? So the title of this slide is the EEG differences are restricted to volitional actions. There's nothing about the background EEG which is different between the voluntary skip block and the externally triggered skip block. It's only a difference in the EEG prior to the actual voluntary skips that you make. So it's not just expectation, it's not just thinking about skipping, it's actually skipping. So you're wrong. Now, I've got some stuff on agency, which I don't know whether we want to hear about. It's quite short, and it's...
Claudia has a question.
Oh, sorry, Clara, yes.
So the question is, there's another variable which is the reward, and I was curious whether the action can change depending on the reward in the previous trials.
Yeah, it's a good question. We've actually done that experiment. There are changes. So first of all, this experiment where we limit or unlimit the number of skips, that's a little bit like reward, because if we tell you that you can't skip as much, that obviously changes how you make money, right? We have done experiments where we've, if I show you the basic, yeah, so if you look at this, you see you get a big reward if you wait for the dots and a small reward when you skip. So we have done experiments where we've changed the relative values of these two rewards, and if you make skipping more rewarding, then you do get changes in the convergence of the EEG, and it begins to converge earlier. So there's a difference in the timing. So it looks like people prepare earlier for bigger rewards. I haven't shown you that data. It's a quite small effect, but it is significant. Okay?
So Patrick, I have a short question.
Yeah.
And I want you to tell me I'm wrong. Because, so you're relying on these GIF diffusion models.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, we're fitting them to the data to explore
Right.
whether they help, and they do help as long as you suggest that the noise is under active control.
Right. But that's also the problem, because now, to fit your data, you just add another free parameter. And that's annoying, isn't it?
It is annoying.
So have you considered other models?
I haven't. No, I haven't. I mean, the DDM is sort of big one out there, and it has a lot of properties which make it attractive. I think if there are others to think about, I'd first of all ask, are they really different from DDM? Because DDM's got a very general quality.
They are. DDM is wrong. It's only, so if you look at competitive models,
Yeah.
you have controlled variability
Yeah.
dependent on, let's say, states of confidence, something like this.
Yeah.
We have to be showing that.
Yeah.
I think it would make a good alternative.
Yeah, right. Yeah, thank you for that. Competitive, I think, is a really interesting idea, but the classic, or the successful competitive modeling normally is stuff like the Chizek work, where you have two alternative actions which are trying to fight to exist. Here, there's only one thing you can do. There's only one skip response you can make. So what you could do is you could fit models which are called, or you could think about what's called time affordance. So you could imagine that there are multiple actions which all happen at different times and are fighting to express themselves. Right. So that's an interesting possibility.
That would account for this as well.
Yeah, I haven't formally tried it. I mean, one feature about this kind of time affordance, that there are always actions trying to express themselves.
But the second model is also annoying because he has another free parameter which is like a timer. It's not nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We can discuss that later. But
the point about time affordance is there's a really, really interesting conceptual question in this area which has never been satisfactorily answered. Because the readiness potential is action locked, it's biased sampling. We're only looking at what happens before the action. It is logically possible that there are readiness potential-like events in the EEG happening all the time. It's logically possible, but unless they're associated with actions, we're not going to see them. Your idea of temporal affordance clearly predicts that there should be readiness potential-like events happening all the time, but the ones that cause an action should be bigger than the ones that don't. So you'd expect to see lots of mini RPs happening all the time. Now, in principle, you could do a kind of multivariate search through the data to see, is that true or is it not? Are RPs uniquely associated with actions, or are there RP-like events happening all the time? It's a really obvious point, which lots of people in the field have made, but I've never seen a proper analysis of whether there really are or are not RP-like events happening all the time. So that's one of my next plans, is to look in more detail. So let's talk a little bit about agency. So, okay. Sense of agency and reward-based learning. Wittgenstein. What is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm? So, philosophy, profound, challenging. Now, he asked this question, in fact, in a kind of ironic sense. He thought it was a stupid question. I think it's not a stupid question. And I think there is an answer to his question. And one answer is the sense of agency. So I have a sense of agency when I raise my arm, but I don't have a sense of agency, for example, if you come up and raise my arm for me. I just don't feel I did it, I feel you did it. So the sense of agency is defined as the feeling that one controls one's own actions, and this is the important bit, and through them, events in the outside world. So the really important point about the voluntary motor system is not that we can internally generate an action, but that we can make a difference by doing so. So with our actions, we can do things. We can change the world. So if you look around you, everything that you see is a product of human agency. So somebody built this building, somebody made the chair, somebody assembled your laptop. Somebody has made all of those things happen through their action. And that's pretty incredible, because there's no other animal which has, or no other brain, which can do that quite as well as we can. So a bird can make a nest, but it can't do a lot more. We can do a lot more. We can really change the world. So the idea about agency is that we produce voluntary actions, we move our bodies, and we produce effects or outcomes or consequences in the outside world. Volition, the first part of my talk, is about this. Agency is about how do you link what you do to the outcome that you get. How do you make stuff happen? And of course, volition and agency are clearly linked. So we're going to use the Libet method. And now what we're going to do is we're going to have people making voluntary actions to press the button. But these voluntary actions are really interesting and really goal-directed, and they really change the world because they make a beep happen. So your status as an agent in this experiment is to change the world by producing beeps. right? So you make a voluntary action and it goes beep, and that's just great. That's a really good laboratory model of technology, civilization, etc., etc. Okay, and you have to report in one block of trials, you report when you press the button. In another block of trials, you report when you heard the beep. And using this very simple mental chronometry method, we discovered a long time ago now a phenomenon called, or an effect called intentional binding. So I'll just go through this a little bit slowly. Intentional binding is a putative marker of the sense of agency. It's a putative, quantitative way that we can understand and measure this feeling of, I did that. We have one block of trials where you're watching the clock rotating, you don't make any actions at all, and suddenly the computer goes beep, and you have to report the time on the clock at which you think you heard the beep. And interestingly, people often say they heard it before it actually happened. And then we have an agency block where you press the button anytime you feel like it. There's a delay, and then you hear exactly the same beep, and you report the time of the beep. And what you find is that in this condition, people perceive the beep as happening much earlier, closer to the time of their voluntary action, and shifted relative to the time at which they hear a beep, which they did not produce themselves. So what we're analyzing is this shift in the perceived time of the beep because I made it happen, because it was mine. And we can do exactly the same now on the action side, so we can have a block of trials where you make a voluntary action which doesn't have any consequence at all, and we can ask people, when do you think you pressed the button? People think they pressed the button a little bit before they did. That's fine. What's more interesting is if you press the button and it changes the world by producing a beep, you perceive the action as shifted towards the beep. So putting those two things together, in reality, the action and the beep are always separated by 250 milliseconds. We take a baseline condition of when each of these events is perceived to happen by itself, that's shown by the dashed line, and we compare it to a block of trials where you have judgments of the action when it produces a beep, or judgments of the beep when it's produced by an action, and we measure these perceptual shifts in milliseconds. So we don't directly measure the interval between the action and the beep, but we can infer it. And what you can see is that people perceive the action and the beep as closer together in time than they really are. So this is exactly what David Hume would say. You associate the cause and the effect, the action and the outcome. Your mind, your brain is binding together what you do. All right? And this seems to me exactly consistent with understanding, I did that. You experience the I and the that close together. What's it got to do with intention? Well, here's the critical control condition. This is a younger version of me, and this is my then postdoc, and this is a TMS coil. So he is going to use the computer to discharge the electrical current through the coil, produces a magnetic field, which goes into the motor cortex, and it produces completely involuntary movements of the right hand, which are like little twitches. And these movements are exactly the same muscle that I would use to press the button in a voluntary block. So we've got something which is physically comparable to a voluntary action, but clearly involuntary. So for those of you who've never tried it, this is really fun because it produces a very, very strange experience that your body is moving, but it's not you. Right? It's really quite interesting. So it's a condition of non-agency. And I won't show the video for reasons of time. So I've shown you this already. This is the voluntary condition, and this is what happens when you have an involuntary TMS-induced twitch of the muscle followed by a beep. Now you don't get binding of the twitch towards the beep, you actually get repulsion. And it's almost as though the brain is sort of saying, oh, Patrick, watch out, don't be fooled by that dodgy guy with his TMS machine. This is nothing to do with you. You know, this beep, be suspicious, keep these things apart. You're not doing that. So the interaction here is significant, and the binding effect is significant. It's been replicated now dozens of times. It's pretty robust. And it looks as though there's really something about making things happen which changes our experience of what we're doing. There's a construction of a particular mental experience of agency. What I want to tell you about here is not, I mean, there are lots of papers now on intentional binding. What I want to tell you about again is this idea of how can we make these voluntary actions that change the world sort of reasons responsive, useful, linked to doing, to non-arbitrary, functional. So we embedded this task in a reversal learning task. So this is an experiment on action binding and reversal learning. The experiment's twice as interesting because you're watching the clock and you can either press the button with your right hand or with your left hand. It's completely up to you. The buttons are probabilistically mapped to two tones. So if you press the button with your right hand, you've got an 80% chance of getting a boop and a 20% chance of getting a beep. And if you press the button with your left hand, you've got 80% chance of getting a beep and 20% chance of getting a boop. And beep means money and boop means no money. Right, so what you're trying to do is you're foraging on these two keys and you're trying to get beep, 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 beep. You're becoming like a beep junkie and you're trying to make voluntary actions which will give you fixes of beeps and money. And every time you press the button and you hear the beep, you have to report the perceived time of the action, the time on the clock at which you press the button. We're only interested here in the action. And we can come back to that later. So you've got free choice between actions. Now, this is really easy. It's really easy to learn where the beeps are, but the problem is that the mapping reverses unpredictably. So after a random number of key presses, which you cannot predict, suddenly the key that was beepful becomes boopful, and you start to lose money or not gain money. And then this is quite interesting because it means that you have to decide every time, what am I doing? So suppose you press the button on the left and you get beep, 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 beep. This is great. If you get a boop, then maybe it's just one of these 20% nasty boop trials. So you might keep going with the left key. But if you get two boops in a row, then maybe the mapping has switched. Maybe, oh, I need to change the way I relate to the world. So this is a classic probabilistic reversal learning task. It's been well studied in animals and in humans. And the classic way that they look at the learning element is to look at the proportion of correct responses as a function of the key press number, with 0 being the moment where the mapping reverses, the unpredictable reversal. So people are performing well, and then when the mapping reverses, they make a mistake, and then they gradually learn to change key. All right, and you can fit this with a model which I'm going to come on to now. So the classic Riscola-Wagner type model suggests that you calculate for each action the prediction error, which is the difference between what you actually get and the so-called action value, what you predicted you would get when you press the button. Okay, and you update the action values for next time. So if you the expected action value on the next trial is equal to the action value on this trial plus some learning rate times the prediction error. And the critical thing is that you can have one learning rate for beeps and another learning rate for boops. You can learn from success and you can learn from error. All right? And then that will help you to work out what to do next time. Now, what I'm going to show you here, let's just look at the right-hand part of the graph. Forget the left-hand graph. What we're going to look at is the right-hand part of the graph here. And this is the action binding, in other words, the shift in the perceived time of when you press the button towards the subsequent beep or boop. And I've shown this for trial T+1 as a function of what happened on trial T. So here in light gray, we find that after a trial where you get a beep and you make a bit of money, you get a binding of the action towards the next beep of around 30 milliseconds. But if on the previous trial you screwed up and you got a boop, you actually get more binding of the action towards the outcome on the next trial. It doesn't matter whether this key press produces a beep or a boop. It matters whether the last key press produces a beep or a boop. When you screwed up, you have a stronger feeling of agency, association between what you do and what happens, perhaps more attention to the consequences of your actions after an error than after a success. All right? So we didn't believe that. We called this the post-error agency boost. We didn't believe it. We did it again. So here, this is a new group of people. And once again, we find that after a positive outcome on trial T, then on trial T+1, there's a binding of the action towards the beep, but there's an even stronger binding of the action towards the beep following an error. All right? Now, This is exactly the same people, but now in a different block of trials, they're unable to learn because the relation between the key that you press and the beep or the boop is completely random. So you can't learn to make beeps. There's just no mapping. And you don't get any action binding at all, and you don't get this difference following an error. You don't get more binding following an error. So only when you can learn, you get this interesting change in the way that you experience your own action, so that you seem to get more agency after an error, post-error agency boost. That's a meta-analysis showing that the effect is small but robust. Okay, so with the reinforcement learning model, you can fit people's behavior to all that, and you can, as I say, get a positive learning rate and a negative learning rate. And interestingly, if you look at the post-error boost in action binding, that's this measure of the extent to which you feel a stronger sense of agency after an error. This is positively correlated with the difference between the negative and the positive learning rate. So what this means is that people out here who learn a lot from errors show strong post-error agency boost, and people here who seem to only learn from success show weak post-error agency boost. So there's something about the ability to learn from errors which causes this strong sense of agency on the post-error trial. A couple more slides, then we'll have some questions. Now, this is a small group of people with mild to moderate Parkinson's disease, and this is their action binding. And what you can see is that they show no action binding, and they show no difference between the action binding following a beep, positive on the previous trial, and following a boop, an error on the previous trial. An age-matched control group do show the difference, and the interaction is significant. So the t-tests within each group aren't significant, but the interaction is significant. Moreover, if you look at the learning rates, this is something which has been shown before, Parkinson's patients have the same learning rates as age-matched controls following a success, but a much lower learning rate following an error. People with Parkinson's disease can't learn from errors. They can't update what to do next when they screw up, and they don't seem to experience this stronger sense of agency following an error. So this points to something about the corticostriatal dopamine system as being important in producing this error-based feeling of, I can do that next time. So this is an interesting slide. Anybody who's British may recognize this picture because it's from the Ladybird books, which are a set of books that all children of my age grew up, or people of my age grew up with. So this is the history of Scotland, and this is somebody called Robert the Bruce, who was the first king of Scotland. And like all good kings of Scotland, his main job was to kill the English. So he he raised an army, and he had a battle with the English, and he lost. So he raised another army, and he had another battle with the English, and he lost, and then the same thing happened again. And the third time, the army was completely wiped out except for him. So he escaped alone, and he ended up in this cave in the west of Scotland. And he was quite depressed because he was thinking, how will I ever beat the English? And he saw a spider which was trying to spin a web across the mouth of the cave. And the spider was letting down its thread to make the web, and it fell, and the thread broke. And then it climbed back up, and it started another thread, and it fell, and the thread broke, and then it climbed back up. And eventually the poor spider, after 3 or 4 attempts, managed to spin the thread and to make a nice web across the mouth of the cave. And Robert the Bruce said, aha, this is the way to beat the English. So the moral of this story is, if at first you don't succeed, try and try and try again. So Robert the Bruce, of course, raised another army, and he fought the English again, and he completely trashed them, and he threw them out, and he started the first independent kingdom of Scotland. So that was a very happy ending. And I think this is probably what's going on in this post-error agency boost. So it's quite important, if you make an error, that you try again, otherwise natural selection will probably not give you much time. So I think the post-error agency boost is a subjective superstructure, a kind of experience of motivating and attending and benefiting from the actions that we make after errors. So just to conclude, this second section, distinctive sense of agency accompanies goal-directed actions. This sense of agency reflects a cognitive mechanism for predictively linking actions to outcomes. I haven't talked much about prediction. It tracks error-based instrumental learning, and I think it makes volition useful. So the only reason for being interested in volition is not because I can press the button, but because of what I can make happen by doing so, and this may be the basis of responsibility. So these are the people who did all the work. They're all fantastic. Thank you very much, and thanks for your time.
Patrick, thank you very much for this great talk. Now it's time for some more questions. All right, who has the will to pose more questions?
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Did you find any difference between age or even gender in the ability to learn from these mistakes?
We didn't actually look for it. Although there is enough data here to do a correlation, so there are 30 people in this study, which is about what you would begin to look. But, it's a weird experiment, so it's white, educated, industrialized. I can't remember the gender balance. Normally it's mostly women. These would be small effects, right? So, women and men can learn from experience, and they have a sense of agency. So I wouldn't expect anything big. I think these are very basic sensory motor functions that we basically all share, unless there's some pathology.
So, thanks for the great talk. So I'm not really sure about the sense of agency as a sort of mechanism to integrate more prediction errors, because we're at the end also able to learn from errors and mistakes of other people, right? Maybe equally well or sometimes better than when we make mistakes ourselves. And in that case, you would expect not to have any sense of agency. Right.
Well, what we're talking about is the sense of agency on the trial after the error.
Right.
Okay. So there are some differences on the trial when you make an error. So I didn't talk much about them, and they're not very, very reliable. But in this particular experiment, here we're looking at the perceived time of the tone, the outcome. Right. So on the whole, people show more binding of beeps, that's positive outcomes, more binding of negative outcomes, more binding of boops back towards the action that caused them than beeps. Okay, so you tend to, if you accept intentional binding as a measure of sense of agency, which not everybody does, you would tend to say that people have a stronger sense of agency when they screw up. This finding, we don't always get it, so I haven't made a lot out of it. This finding is robust. So it's the way you experience what happens afterwards on the next trial.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. And my question was about this action binding. I'm not someone who's familiar with the literature here, but I was just wondering if you assume that making a mistake makes you more alert when you become aware of it. It may be, you become somehow aroused or something. It increases your attention. And we know that the brain does not have a chronometer built in, so you don't have an accurate way to tell time and judge these things. Could you not account for these differences in estimating the duration, the difference between when you made a decision and when something actually happened, as just your state messing around with your ability to judge very, very short time intervals?
Right, so first of all, lots of interesting questions there. It's quite possible that this is a quite general kind of arousal alertness effect. It's quite possible that when you make an error, you think, right, come on, Patrick, concentrate hard. And this is the reason why you have this altered experience of time on the next trial. So it could just be due to some non-specific kind of alertness. One thing I would say is we're not measuring intervals here. We're measuring events. So there's a massive difference in psychology between interval timing and event timing. You'd expect them to be consistent, but they're not. So almost all studies on the experience of time are how long you think a duration is. Here, what I'm asking is, when do you think something happened? which is not the same thing. And although I'm making inferences about perceived duration, I'm measuring perceived time, perceived event timing. So we know that when people are aroused or attentive, the so-called internal clock beats faster. We know that the perceived duration of events changes. But simply changing the speed of a clock cannot explain why the timing of a single event might shift forwards or backwards. So I can't rule out an attentional explanation, but I don't think it's the same attentional explanation as, makes time pass at different rates when you're either paying attention or not.
Can you put the slide on the Parkinson's patients back? So what worries me about this is that, do Parkinson's patients have a disturbed sense of agency? Because if not, then that kind of is problematic for your view that the action binding indicates experience of agency.
Right. So, of course, binding is a putative measure of sense of agency. So I don't know how to answer your question. So one way to answer your question, you said, do Parkinson's patients have an abnormal sense of agency? So do you mean, if you explicitly ask them, do they describe abnormalities in their sense of their ability to control the world? Or do you mean, do they have abnormal intentional binding? They do have abnormal intentional binding, that's been shown before. Typically, the big change is in the perceived time of the tone. Big change in previous studies has been in the perceived time of the tone. Here we're interested more in the perceived time of the action, because that seems to be the thing that changes in this reversal learning task.
Yeah, clearly what's happening in Parkinson's patients is they've got disturbed dopamine system. So an explanation of the result is that their dopamine system isn't operating correctly, so all the other consequences of that, including this interesting shift in time perception, are affected.
Yeah.
But for that to be about agency, you would expect some change in the sort of qualia of feeling that they were acting or making a decision.
Right, so this depends on what you mean by the sense of agency. So a lot of people say, well, intentional binding's fine, but it's not agency, and that what we really mean by agency is the qualia of the feeling that I did that. There's a quite tricky methodological problem here. If you ask people to sort of directly describe their qualia of agency, so if you say, did you do that? Do you feel that you raised your arm? You can't trust their answers. And I'll tell you why. It's because of a massive bias called the self-serving bias, which is very, very deep. Imagine that you're working in a group on a group project. Maybe that's part of this summer school, that you all have to form groups and you have to produce an experiment or do a project. And let's suppose that your project massively fails and the robot blows up, and you completely fail to get any significant results, and the computer crashes and nobody had a backup, right? Well, that wasn't my fault. That was her or him. It wasn't, I was doing my job. So if it goes wrong, then I'm not the agent. But let's suppose that your project's brilliant and your model fits excellently, and you discover some new circuit in the mesolimbic system and you put it in Nature Neuroscience. Well, of course it was me. I led that. Of course we were all equal, but I led. It was my idea. So we always tend to attribute agency to ourselves in proportion to the value of the result. And that's clearly a kind of a post hoc reconstructive bias, normally for the benefit of other people or for the benefit of how we appear in the face of other people. So I think that this idea that we somehow have some perfect access to the qualia of agency is actually wrong. And in almost all of my work on sense of agency, I've tended to prefer to use an implicit measure, like when did you do that, for which people can't really cheat, or they can't really kind of say what they think makes them look best. They actually have to say what they experienced, and then we can use that to infer the extent to which their mind is linking action to outcome.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is, in a sense, you're redefining volition and agency in terms of, was there some brain process that resulted in this? So rather than was there some conscious experience that resulted in this, because you're specifically discounting conscious experience as unreliable. But I mean, just to go back to the point about Parkinson's, there are people, clinical conditions, where people specifically report a loss of an experience of agency.
Yeah.
So it would be really interesting to test those people in your
Yeah.
experiment.
No, we've done some of that.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So
And any insights from that? Or?
So we've got a single case report of a person with anarchic hand. So anarchic hand is perhaps the most interesting case. So people with anarchic hand syndrome, which often follows a medial frontal lesion, will make movements that seem voluntary, but they will deny that they have agency over them. So a rather classic example is that if there's a glass on the table, they'll drink from it. If there's a keyboard, they'll start typing, and they won't know why they're doing it. And if you say, well, why are you drinking from the glass? Why are you typing? They'll say, oh, I don't know. I just thought it just happened. I don't know how. They don't feel that they are the source of their own actions. So that's a sort of rather flagrant pathology of agency. But a couple of interesting features about anarchic hand. First of all, the actions that they make, these so-called anarchic actions, they are almost always triggered by an obvious environmental stimulus. They have this reflexive quality. If it's a glass, they'll drink. If it's a door, they'll open it. So it's almost as if the voluntary brain has the job of inhibiting the normal tendency to be driven by the affordance of the environment. And what's lacking in anarchic hand, and which gives them this strange experience that their body does stuff which they don't want, is that they're unable to inhibit all of the triggers, environmental triggers, which capture our actions. So there's an inhibitory quality there, which makes it a little bit tricky to study.
So Patrick, this is fantastic fact, and in some sense it also relates very well to this issue of acquired non-use you might see in stroke patients, which we also looked at quite a bit.
Yes.
Where also you can show that, let's say, errors due to action have a huge negative knock-on effect in the control that you can also restore again if you manipulate error. And that's also something that Belen wanted to pose a question about.
That's really interesting.
It didn't happen. She didn't wield herself to the microphone. But we can talk about it later. But now in the boost that you observe, you would expect that this will probably not occur on any possible time interval between action and outcome.
Yeah.
So what's the specific time window in which this can play out?
That's a very good question, and I'd like to talk more about the stroke, but let's first of all talk about the time interval. We haven't looked at the time interval for the post-error agency boost specifically. We know that the intentional binding effect in general, the tendency to perceive action and outcome as closer together than they are, we know that that works for action-outcome intervals up to 4 or 5 seconds. Yeah. I tend to always work at very short intervals because I come from the motor system and actions are quick. But other people have studied it up to 4 seconds.
Is the warping then sort of proportional to that interval?
Right, good question. At short intervals, using the event timing method with the rotating clock, the shift seems to be constant. And that's how we know that it's not just a change in clock speed. So if it was a change in clock speed, it would be proportional. At longer intervals, people use an absolute judgment paradigm where you just say verbally how long you think the interval between action and outcome was. So you say, oh, I think that was 2.5 seconds. And there you tend to get proportionality. And that may be a difference between sub-second and suprasecond timers. I think the point about stroke is really interesting because what you're saying about stroke patients is that they're not learning from error in the right way. So what you're doing is you're trying to give them the belief that their errors are smaller than they are in order to make sure that they can learn. Now, why is that the case? So why are they not showing any post-error agency boost? I'm assuming that they're not, because they're showing a phenomenon like absence of post-error agency boost. Is it because of their brain, or is it because the errors are so massive? So is it because they are unable to even pick up an apple, and the prediction error signal is too big, it sort of swamps? Or is it rather that there's something about the strokes or something about some strokes, perhaps in one hemisphere rather than the other, which impairs this ability to try and try and try again and have the experience that you can succeed.
Wait, that's an interesting interpretation, but what it looks like, it's a rather generic phenomenon that in some of the people sacrifice agency over a limb because the limb is unreliable.
Yeah.
So it has exceeded some threshold of functionality.
Yeah.
And what we showed then in these interventions that we apply, that the work Belen has been doing, is that if you now through virtual reality start to get minimize that error, that it becomes manageable, and very quickly you can restore. Okay?
Very interesting.
Okay, we can talk about it in more
Yeah.
detail later.
Yeah.
But then the warping you see here, the agency boost, is the difference between the shift in the action and the outcome. But now, if you look at this curve, where you showed, okay, some people are better learners from errors than others,
Yep.
can you split this out again towards the action warping versus the outcome warping?
Right, good question. Here, this is only the change in the perceived time of the action. This is just what we call action binding.
Okay.
So you, in these reversal learning paradigms, there are changes in the perceived time of the tone. The tone does get shifted back towards the action, but they don't interact robustly with beep, boop, positive, negative. So the interest here is mostly about the actions, not the tones.
But so what would be your prediction if we now look at the outcome aspect?
Well, we did that, and in one study here, there's a tendency to show more binding on this trial. So you press the button, you get a boop or a beep, and you tend to show a little bit more binding for boops than for beeps. So errors produce stronger binding than successes. That result didn't replicate in a subsequent experiment, so I haven't published it, so it may be a fluke. There is an interesting, rather different story about the relationship between binding and valence. So we've done studies, I don't have them, I think, in this deck, but we've done studies where you press a button and instead of a sound, you get a human vocalization, which is either positive, whoo, or negative, there you get really strong binding effects, and the positive sounds bind more than the fearful sounds. And there are 2 papers on that. Yeah.
And now I have to read them.
I think I don't have the slides yet. Yeah.
Do we have other questions for Patrick? Okay.
Hi, thanks. I'm wondering, sort of, this post-error agency boost, could this sort of also be tied in some way, or have you looked at how this could tie to a sense of body ownership instead of just agency?
Yeah, great question. So there's a big, in this whole field, there's a lot of arguments about agency and ownership, and these are both different aspects of selfhood. So we often ask, what's a person, what's self-consciousness, what's it like to be me? And 2 really important elements of self-awareness are the experience that I am a body, or I have a body, and the experience that I can do stuff. I can lift my arm, and I can have agency both over my arm and over the external world through it. So there's a very interesting sort of philosophical, but also potentially neuroscientific argument about what's the relationship between the body and the will, or the ownership and agency. So I think the most interesting thing about agency is the capacity to generate commands, which then move the limbs and change the external world. So I think the thing about agency is the generative part, that I initiate it, I start it, I make it happen. And that seems to me relatively disembodied. So there's a very, very interesting question about, would you have a sense of agency if you were using a BCI rather than moving your body, if you were somehow making disembodied actions, or if you were making something happen by thought alone without bodily mediation, would you have a sense of agency? And I guess my feeling is you would. So I think the body is not the important part of this sense of agency effect. I think what's important in the sense of agency effect is the capacity to initiate. So I don't think, I haven't specifically thought about post-error agency boost, but I think in general, sense of agency is to do with the source of action, not the fact that most of our actions happen to involve our bodies. Just to give you one little piece of example, in the basic intentional binding effect, you'll remember that perhaps the most dramatic binding is that when you press the button and you produce a beep, the beep is perceived as much earlier than it really is, or than it's perceived to occur in the baseline conditions. That's this number here. So we were lucky enough to test in this paradigm somebody called Ian Waterman, who is a star patient with deafferentation below the neck. So he can make a voluntary movement to press a button, but for functional purposes, he is disembodied. He has no somatic feedback telling him that he has pressed the button, or you could treat him as being bodiless in a way, or certainly as having a pathology of embodiment. Now, we can't really ask much about his perception of the button press because the motor output is quite clumsy because he has no sensory feedback. But we can ask, when do you think you heard the tone? Right? Do you show binding of the tone back towards the disembodied action? And he's completely normal. He's in the normal range. So my feeling is that you don't need a body to have an intentional binding effect.
But Patrick, did you voluntarily say that? Because it seems that that would contradict your earlier definition on slide 2 or 3, where your very first feature
leads to movement. Yeah, good point. So that's a very interesting.
Are we talking to a different Patrick now?
That's a very interesting question. So I think there's and I'm talking completely speculatively, and it's a pity that you're recording all this because it will probably be very controversial.
And I'm going to use it against you.
Yes, oh, of course you are. I know you. Right, so at some point in our ontogeny, we have to learn to become voluntary. If I look at a newborn baby, I don't think they have a lot of volition, and I don't think they have a lot of agency. And, you and I, we can do anything we want, and that's our community. So at some point, we learn to produce commands, to have a will, and to make that will do things. I would love to understand that. None of us can remember the period of our lives where we had no agency. But once we were all tiny babies and we couldn't do anything. So somehow, during the development of the brain, two important capacities evolve. One is the capacity to initiate particular neural signals. The second is the capacity to understand the consequences of those neural signals. I call those volition and agency. For me, it's a completely contingent fact that the volitional signals that I learned happen to connect to my motor cortex and make my body move. A radical empiricist proposal would suggest that if you transplanted my prefrontal cortex at birth into some other substrate, then I might evolve the capacity to initiate, maybe not, we wouldn't call them actions, but commands, which would be outsourced to a robot. They wouldn't go through my primary motor cortex at all. They'd go through some other device, an artificial device, and produce some physical events. And if I had the right transplanted perceptual apparatus, I would develop a sense of agency. So it's a contingent biological fact that the sense of agency is associated with movement and motor areas, because I think it's driven by command. Good question.
All right, Patrick, thank you very much for this great talk.
Thank you.